Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the CILLID organizing committee, I would like to welcome you all to this activity. I am
Good morning,
Professor
everyone.
I am Professor Alex Alves Egido. I am a member of the Second International Congress on Language, Literature, and Discourse, and I am a professor on the master program PG Letras at UFMA. I will be moderating Dr. Sal Consoli's talk entitled Researcher Reflexivity in Applied Linguistics. Agora eu convido o professor Sal para dividir a tela comigo. E Dr. Sal is a lecturer in language education at the University of Edinburgh. His research interests include research ethics and reflexivity in applied linguistics and in education more broadly. In particular, Dr. Consoli has developed the concept of life capital. And from this moment on, I'll simply call you Sal. So Sal, once again, thank you so much for accepting this invitation. And welcome back, even though virtually, to Maranhão. And then the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex. Can I just check that you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Right, so I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully you can see everything. Right. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Fantastic. So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. Muito obrigado. It's lovely to connect again with Maranhão, although at a distance right now. So I'm going to talk to you today about a topic that is very dear to my heart, and that is reflexivity in the field of applied linguistics. This is the overview of the talk. Firstly, I'll tell you more about the topic and why reflexivity has become so important recently. Then I will kind of take you back to the history of the topic in the wider social sciences, and then we'll go back to applied linguistics, which is one of my areas of expertise. And then I will talk about reflexivity as an important practice for epistemological diversity and inclusivity in research. And we'll look at a couple of case studies. And then we'll talk about reflexivity as methodological support for research rigor. And finally, I'll conclude with some more recent debates on the matter. Now, first of all, I'd like to begin with a definition. Without trying to promote too much my work, this definition does come from my book with Sarah Ganassim. In this Routledge book, we define the notion of reflexivity as reflexivity being the sets of dispositions and activities by which researchers locate themselves within the research processes, whilst also attending to how their presence, their values, their beliefs, their knowledge, and personal and professional histories shape their research spaces, relationships, and outcomes. There's a lot in this definition, okay? But the main thing is that the researcher is really at the center of the research journey, and the researcher needs to think about how their behavior, their actions are going to shape and affect the research processes, but also particularly how their life history, their beliefs, and their relationships towards the research context and the topic will also have an impact on the research outcomes. Now, why suddenly this focus on reflexivity? Now, reflexivity is not a new concept. That's something we need to say. In fact, reflexivity has its roots in the fields of psychology, anthropology, sociology, and even human geography. But it is fair to say that in more recent years, the field of social sciences has experienced what we call a reflexive turn. So a shift towards an attention to the researcher's origins, biography, locality, and intellectual bias. And all this whilst recognizing the importance of the humanity that is very much embedded in the processes and the content of our social inquiries. So it is very difficult to give a definition of reflexivity, although I already did in my book. But within the wider social sciences, it's quite difficult to give a definition of reflexivity that does justice to the many traditions that have contributed to our understanding of this phenomenon. So while I can safely say that with my book, my co-author and I, we align with the view that reflexivity relates to the researcher's dispositions and their action, and then acknowledging their presence in the research processes, all of this is important. It's very difficult to say this is a universal definition for reflexivity, because every researcher's journey and every research project reality are ever so unique. That means we need to really adapt and comprehend the local circumstances of the reality under investigation. Some definitions or some debates on the notion of reflexivity within the social sciences point to reflexivity being an ongoing, multifaceted and dialogical process. In other words, reflexivity is a practice that we cannot truly observe because the observer, in a way, the researcher, has an impact on the reflexive process. So researchers are encouraged to pay attention to what in the literature is referred to as discourses of reflexivity or representations of reflexivity in order to basically reflect on the complexity of the realities that we research and investigate. In more recent years, Ashley Simpson has talked about a critical dialogical practice between the self, ourselves, and the other in our own research. So a critical understanding of who we are as researchers, but also understanding how the connection manifests and evolves between ourselves, the researchers in the research, and the other people involved in the research, or the context within the research, and all the different unique factors that contribute to our research setting. There has to be a critical understanding of the relationships between the researcher and all those different elements within a research experience. Now, for a long time, the social sciences have concerned themselves with issues or debates of objectivity or neutrality to the point of erasing, if you like, the humanity of the people that we research and our own humanity as well as researchers. Now, this is not to say that certain research traditions, and I'm referring here to post-positivist research traditions. I'm not trying to say that those are not good or that others are better than others, but simply that this is a fact that for quite some time, we were concerned with being very objective, neutral in our research. But in recent years, perhaps many have somehow reconsidered these notions of objectivity and universal truths, because we, researchers are humans working closely with participants who are also humans with their own idiosyncrasies, which in a way create this human relationship that reduces our ability as researchers to become detached from the research phenomenon or the research reality that we are investigating. So again, I'm not discrediting certain research traditions, but I want to emphasize that in recent decades, we have reconsidered notions of objectivity, neutrality, and detachment from research for the very reason that we are humans doing human research. So with this, we recognize, those of us discussing reflexivity, in this modern light, recognize that there is a difficulty in offering a generalization of behavior or behaviors or phenomena that we investigate, because offering a generalization which is an absolute truth would inevitably fail to reflect the complexity, the multi-layered realities, or the very stories of the individuals that are part of our research. And already in 1991, Rigg talked about the messiness that comes with opening our studies to real people living real lives. So, years ago, for example, in the field of language education, which is one that I belong to, many studies were conducted within labs. So researchers would create an artificial setting or scenario where learners or teachers would be placed, and then researchers would create a number of variables to control and determine what happened in that particular research lab or research setting. Now, that research was and is still valuable because a lot of that research has helped us arrive at theories of language education or other areas of applied linguistics. But one limitation of that research is that often, perhaps not always, but often, that kind of lab research with such level of control failed to reflect the complexities, but also the messiness of what really happens in the real world. If you walk into a classroom, I think it's fair to say that what happens in a classroom without any level of control will be quite different from what happens in a lab setting where, somebody's trying to control certain factors, variables, and actors within that scenario. So we therefore push for reflexivity as a way to become aware of the complexities, the messiness of the real world that's difficult to control, and also becoming quite inclusive of the subjective realities and the subjective stories that each individual brings to our research projects. Now, I cannot talk about reflexivity without mentioning one of the earliest proponents of the concept, and in this case, the French philosopher Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu was a sociologist in France who suggested the notion of epistemic reflexivity. Now, at that time, Bourdieu thought of reflexivity as a critical practice of reflection that concerned our own social circumstances and experiences to understand how that affected our generation of our creation of knowledge. Now, let's not forget that obviously Bourdieu lived in a particular point in time and history where those notions of objectivity, which I talked about earlier, were actually quite popular, and if not one of the main goals of social science research. And that is why he, at the time, talked about a sociology of sociology in the sense that researchers needed to become aware of their own biases and the effects that their own dispositions and their own internalized subjectivities could have on what he called, at the time, researcher objectivity. So as you can see, there's a stark contrast between the way I've presented reflexivity already at the start of this talk and how Bourdieu talked about, in those days. And this is important for me because I do not wish to criticize Pierre Bourdieu's work, particularly because if Pierre Bourdieu was alive today, I'm sure that he would be saying something slightly different or something that would look more like an extension of what he said back in 1991 or in the early 2000s. Okay, so this is just to give you a bit of a background into the notion of reflexivity. It is not a criticism of Bourdieu's work in any shape or form. Okay, so moving back, or rather moving towards applied linguistics, it is true that researchers have often been quite open and transparent about difficult questions that they faced throughout their research journey. But even if many people, many researchers in the field of applied linguistics have done so for quite some time, they've not always systematically or consistently addressed issues about their own stance, their own life trajectories, or the kind of struggles that they experienced in relation to their own positionalities throughout the research process. This is not to say that they've not been sensitive, though, to issues of being aware of our own self, or rather being self-aware. And there's a list of people that I put here: David Block, Ron Darwin, Steve Mann, Bonnie Norton, Margaret Earley. They've all already shown important insights into issues of reflexivity, perhaps without talking it without calling it reflexivity, but without addressing the overall camp of reflexivity. They have touched upon issues of self-awareness as researchers who do work with other humans. But importantly, I'd like to say that reflexivity is not something that should be reduced to a sketch or a summary of someone's positionality or motivation for a research topic, which is what really happens a lot in publications or in research theses that we see these days. In a way, just having a paragraph about your positionality or motivation kind of leaves out a lot of idiosyncratic intricacies about that one researcher's individual, personal, and professional story, which brought them to that particular research topic and project. So, in a way, the kind of research publications that only put forward a short or small, tidy paragraph on the researcher positionality or motivation for that particular topic, they kind of give prominence to the participant's voice, and they somehow attempt to hide the researcher's voice. But in my view, the researcher's voice is actually a very powerful, important, essential voice, because without the researcher, there will be no research. The researcher guides everything from the moment of designing, formulating the research questions, to designing the research procedures, to conducting the research, to interpreting the data, to disseminating the results. So the researcher's voice is ever so important, and therefore I believe that it should be foregrounded more clearly at all stages of the research process. In some more radical cases, unfortunately, in some publications, there is no recognition whatsoever of the representations of the self, of the researcher's self, and the behaviors within that project. And I think that's even worse. Now, the danger or the dangers of producing a research publication that is decontextualized or detached from the researchers and the participants' life experiences and very unique circumstances of that particular setting means that we are writing and talking about something that does not reflect the messiness of the real world. As I said earlier, the world we live in is ever so complex. And if we try to remove, these elements of self data, if you like, it means that we are producing something which is quite sterile, quite detached from the real world. And of course, being reflexive and opening up to these complexities or this messiness means accepting and embracing the discomfort that comes with becoming involved with other people in social inquiry. That means that a researcher working with other people cannot predict everything that's going to happen according to plan, that there will be some surprises, there will be some tensions, there will be some problems, there will be issues, but also experiences that they could have not anticipated, and they need to attend to those. Now, these days, or for quite some time, researchers have also lived under the pressure of being methodologically perfect and tidy, and therefore they thought that they would need to fight against anything that looked untidy, anything that looked out of place, or that didn't quite fit within the plans of the research design and program. But, producing these neat and very tidy publications, in my view, only gives the impression that researchers have been very busy cleaning or polishing the results of that research experience and leaving out a lot of the interesting, fascinating, and complex realities that belong to each research phenomenon and the people within. In the past, especially in the fields of sociology and nursing, criminology, and in some respect also education, reflexivity has been promoted as a practice through discourses or ideas of warning, alert, or danger. In other words, not just to spot the researcher's self in the empirical work that we're looking at, but also to ensure that the very researcher themselves would not harm, contaminate, prejudice the rigor and the overall quality of the research project itself. So to give you a couple of examples here, I've got a couple of quotes from Berger. For example, says reflexivity serves to carefully self-monitor the impact of the researcher's biases, beliefs, and personal experiences. So you see, the idea of self-monitoring as if these elements are going to cause something negative. And below, this quote from Finley that says, reflexivity has been equated to the researcher's ability to tell confessional tales about the ways in which they may affect the robustness of the methods used and the validity of the research outcomes. So you see, confessional tales as if the researcher has to confess something bad that they did, to make sure that the research is methodologically sound and valid and trustworthy. What comes to mind is an example of research which is reported in Professor M. Oshioda's book on motivation research, which is one of my interests. That's why I know this example. She talks about a time where in a research project, this particular researcher was looking at the motivation of international students living with host family in the UK to learn English. And at one point, the researcher says that one student, who was also one of the participants of the study, reported that this particular student was experiencing some problems with their host family, and this was affecting the student's well-being. The researcher decided not to do anything about that because the researcher did not want to contaminate the data. the researcher did not want to have an impact on the research, so he didn't do anything about that situation. But obviously, you see an ethical issue as well as a human issue arises here, because if one of your participants tells you that something isn't right, although it's not your job to fix their problem, as a researcher, as a responsible adult who's interacting with an international student who's experiencing problems with their living setting, perhaps you would think of having an interaction with whoever might be able to help, or you might offer some advice, or you might act, right? You would do something rather than not do anything to remain detached from the research process. You see, this is the kind of messiness that I'm talking about. Now, in my book, we offer 10 research-informed studies of reflexivity, which showcase different applied linguistics scenarios and that offer some takeaway points for other researchers. In no way are we professing that these takeaway points should be your lifetime principles for reflexivity. These are suggestions based on practice, hopefully able to give you some inspiration for your own work, and you need to adapt these to your own circumstances, your own resources, your own unique life experiences within your research. Just to give you a couple of examples, in one chapter about emotional reflexivity, Margot Turnbull and Ivy Vu talk about their experience in Hong Kong researching health communication during the COVID crisis. They did their research online and they realized the need for researcher emotional reflexivity or emotion work in their data collection. They realized that they needed to develop important strategies for them to be able to conduct online interviews that were able to respond to the participants' emotions, their own emotions, because let's not forget that the researchers are also humans, and also understanding how emotions ended up shaping the interview processes that they ended up conducting. So you see, we might have a research plan before the field work or data collection starts, but then things happen. And in this case, it was emotions that got involved so much into shaping the research journey of these people. In another case study, Judith Reynolds talked about her experience as she used to be a lawyer who became a researcher in applied linguistics. And she's in a study, she's looking at the multicultural dimensions of meetings with asylum and refugee family members. And she's looking at these encounters through the notions of prospective and retrospective reflexivity, saying that these are fundamental parts of a researcher journey to understand processes. So looking at how a researcher is developing a system to remind herself of key positionality issues. So this researcher was an applied linguist at the time of doing the research, but she also had a story, a past as a lawyer. And, she had to really strike a balance between being a researcher, doing a complex study about multicultural encounters, but having that past, that voice that spoke to her, in legal terms. So she had to really be aware of the fact that she was not a lawyer in the research study, and therefore perhaps she had to resist the urge to provide legal advice, which she couldn't do as a researcher. However, she thought about striking a balance between this awareness that gave her, in a way, some insights that another researcher without that background in law may not have. And she also talks about the importance of products, in other words, reflexivity as a way to shape our own growth as researchers in our own research communities. So this takes me to another concept which is very dear to my heart, which is the notion of life capital. Life capital is a concept that I devised in 2020, and is defined as the richness of one's life experiences, therefore entailing memories, desires, emotions, attitudes, opinions, all of which forms part of the complex web of a human's life. Okay, and all of these can be relatively positive, negative, depending on your own experiences. And my idea is that researchers should be encouraged to bring to the fore their life experiences, both the personal and professional ones, because they are part of what we do, and research is part of our human life experiences. So I don't think we can really detach the two. Obviously, I do not recommend what the literature refers to as unbridled reflexivity. In other words, it doesn't mean that the researcher becomes the one and only focus of the research, because otherwise we're taking the attention away from the research topic that we are interested in. But the researcher needs to embrace reflexivity as a form of, or as a practice that recognizes, respects, and celebrates the researcher's self or selves, professional, personal, rather than a reflexivity that strictly wards off any impact that the researcher may have on their work. In more recent, basically in the last year, I've done quite a bit of work on reflexivity to extend the debates that I've been telling you about so far. And I've brought into the mix the notion of vulnerability. We often think of vulnerability as something that we need to think of when we are perhaps writing, crafting our ethics forms for our research. We think about the vulnerability that our participants might experience. But I suggest that vulnerability is something actually that also researchers experience, and it's something that shape our own decision making and our well-being. So in a way, all the emotional, professional, institutional pressures that we experience as researchers may speak to our vulnerabilities, which are not unique participant related, but they are also concerned with, or they also refer to the researchers' emotional labor, their own identity exposure and disclosure, their moral dilemmas, and so on and so forth. So for me, reflexivity is reframed now as not just an act of disclosing your positionality, but more as a critical engagement with how your own life is shaping the research design, the relationships and interpretations of your work, but how this messy reality is also being shaped by the socio-political, ideological, institutional pressures, ecologies that we inhabit. And in a recent paper that was published about 4 months ago with my good friend and colleague Sarah Ganassin, we talk about 3 interconnected dimensions of researcher vulnerability, which can be looked at through reflexivity. So we talk about emotional engagement. So we recognize that we as humans, so researchers, have human responses to the data, the context, the participants in their work, and therefore they need to practice emotional reflexivity. We need to pause, we need to check in with ourselves. Sometimes we need to step back and realize what needs to be done to protect our own well-being as well as our participants. This then requires moral scrutiny. So we need to critically examine our decisions beyond the no physical harm, because harm can take so many forms. And at a time when we are faced with so many dilemmas concerned with power dynamics, our context, our institutions, new technologies like AI, these factors are shaping our own practices, are shaping our own risks to our participants, to ourselves. So we need to be morally aware of all these different factors and make decisions accordingly. And finally, an important aspect of this dimension of reflexivity is autonomy. Researchers have the agency to adjust the boundaries, the methods, and the timing of the research to safeguard their own well-being. And so we need to be aware of hierarchical settings or hierarchies at all levels of our research work. And the paper that I'm referring to is Reflexivity as a Means to Address Researcher Vulnerabilities, which was published open access, so it's easily accessible, in the journal Applied Linguistics Review. And as you can see on the left, this is the ethics of care informed reflexivity model that we designed to encourage researchers to think about their own researcher ecology, which is the context where we work, inhabit our work, but then thinking about these three elements that interact with or come from the researcher: autonomy, emotional engagement, and moral scrutiny. So to conclude, I would say that reflexivity helps our research to become more trustworthy and rigorous, and more transparent. I think that reflexivity brings to the fore our humanity as researchers, but also as participants. There are complexities that need to be examined throughout research contexts and case studies. And I do think that there is a need for systematic and more theorized accounts of researcher reflexivity in post-positivist quantitative traditions. And of course, vulnerability is an ever important dimensions of social inquiry, and I do think that reflexivity can help us understand and address our vulnerabilities better. So thank you for your time and attention, and now over to you for any questions or comments.
Saul, thank you so very much for sharing about reflexivity and also life capital with us. We do have a couple of questions. I have many. As Professor Saul comes back to the screen here with us, I just want to share with you the book that he mentioned at the very beginning, which is this one, Reflexivity in Applied Linguistics. It was edited by Professor Saul Consoli and Sarah Ganassin, and it brings together a couple of researchers that analyzes some experiences that they have through the lens of reflexivity. So we do have some questions on the chat. I have many as well. Se vocês quiserem fazer perguntas no chat, podem fazer em português, em inglês, em espanhol. O professor Sal recentemente esteve conosco este ano no Maranhão, em uma ocasião presencial, uma ocasião remota, então ele aprendeu um pouquinho de português conosco. Então fiquem à vontade também para fazerem as perguntas em língua portuguesa, tá? As Professor Sal comes back to join us, let me just send him a message, just a second. I want to invite you all to take a look at this paper that Professor Saul mentioned. It's open access. We can share the link with you all back. Sansão, coloque, por favor, o Professor Saul na tela. Just a second, guys. We are having some technical issues. Professor Saul is on the backstage. Just a moment. Sansão, por favor, coloque o Professor Saul na tela.
Are we back?
Thank you so much.
I don't know what happened there, but I went back into the backstage for some reason. Anyway, here we are.
Thank you. So I was just showing your book. I don't know if you were saying.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
So Sal, we have a question by Professor Nayara Sales. She asks like this. In your view, what's the most common misconception researchers have about reflexivity?
There's probably quite a few. The one that comes to mind first is that they associate reflexivity with your identity and positionality, but that's not all. Reflexivity is a process that researchers engage or should engage in throughout a research journey, from the time you think of a topic and formulate your research questions throughout the research data collection, analysis, and so on and so forth. But also, reflexivity is not just telling your story of who you are. Reflexivity is analyzing how who you are affects the research that you're doing, the processes and products of your research. Those are perhaps some of the main misconceptions.
And about positionality, you just mentioned again, it's not just about that. Mm-hmm. So in what moments would you say for a graduate student that's writing the thesis or the dissertation, is there a specific section that you could say here you could try to promote your reflexivity for your reader?
Yeah, so I would probably say that you want to do both positionality and reflexivity. So positionality is really an overview or outline of your identity and your place in your research context in relation to your social status and so on and so forth. And that perhaps could be done at the beginning of your introduction, where you talk about your motivation for your chapter, for your study. But then reflexivity, because I said as a process that happens throughout the research, to be fair, that's something that I would expect to see in every chapter. So in other words, in your writing, you show reflexivity. You show reflexivity in the way you critique other people's research in the literature review. You show reflexivity in the way you write your methodology. You show reflexivity in showing the inner works or complexities or mistakes that happen during data collection and data analysis. You show reflexivity in what makes you interpret your data the way you did. So it's really, for me, it should be embedded in every chapter in the writing itself. Then, of course, you might have a little or more developed paragraph about reflexivity or your reflexive approach, perhaps in the methodology chapter or in the conclusion. That's okay. But that's more like a section where you emphasize certain aspects of your approach to reflexivity. But otherwise, I would expect to see that in the writing itself, as opposed to a particular area of a thesis.
Okay. But in order to materialize this in terms of writing, the researcher first needs to reflect upon it, right? So would you say we have certain tools or certain practices that researchers could implement or use in order to reflect more during the research, like the writing of journals, the writing of narratives in each
Yeah.
stage?
So, for example, in the book, there are 10 examples of, how researchers did reflexivity. And as I said, those are not prescriptions or prescriptive principles. They're more like guiding suggestions, illustrations, because I do believe that everyone could do reflexivity in their own way, depending on the resources they have and where they are in life. So I can think of people that like to audio record their thoughts after they've done an interview or before going into field work. Now, not everyone may have an audio recorder available. You can just jot notes on a piece of paper with your pen and pencil. or for someone like me who uses software for data analysis, I like to write memos on the software. So I got my own data and I make little comments on different sections of a data segment or data extract to remind myself of the analytical thinking that I'm doing about a particular data element. So honestly, I would say that reflexivity is something that you do as you wish to. There is no prescription, because I also think that reflexivity is and should apply. Actually, this goes back to the misconception that you mentioned earlier. One misconception is that reflexivity is only for qualitative research. I absolutely disagree with that, because quantitative researchers or mixed methods researchers do reflexivity as well. You know, the way you design a questionnaire is determined by your own self, your own understanding of certain things. That determines how you design a questionnaire. Or your choice of statistical tests is decided by you. So why does a researcher make certain decisions throughout those processes? So that's important. Reflexivity is for everyone, not just for qualitative researchers. And therefore, my idea is that reflexivity is something that you do in whatever way your own methodological and epistemic tradition and culture allow, but also, and perhaps more importantly, your resources. Sometimes reflexivity can just be a chat with a peer or with your supervisor where you share some thoughts and then you generate more reflection out of it. For example, this morning I had an email from one of my PhD students who said that two of her participants struggled to answer two of her interview questions, and she was concerned because she was thinking whether she should rephrase those questions for the other participants. And I said, no, this is really good information that your participants are giving you, and you just need to reflect on how this is going to work with your other participants. I said, you cannot have one universal question which will work for all your participants, because each will react in different ways. And therefore I said to her, you just have to develop your ability to perhaps rephrase on the moment or come up with some follow-up questions to elaborate. But basically, I was encouraging her to think about how good it was that these participants shared this information, and that she shouldn't see that as, oh my goodness, I don't know how to formulate my question. Rather, this is good reflexivity. This is how humans work in the real world. We cannot use the same question with all our participants. They might react differently. And we need to be reflexive, which means we need to be transparent and aware of that, and then be honest about how we respond. And that in this case, she wrote to me in an email. That's reflexivity. So, there's so many ways it can be done.
Yeah. And then according to your thinking, should include this experience in her writing later on, right?
Let me tell you what I said to her. Hang on, I got it here. Let me see. So I said, so the first problem I said, great, this makes your study even more interesting. Please report this in the methods chapter. Such great transparency and reflexivity, many exclamation marks. And then she also told me about there was a research instrument that she used several times with many participants. And at one point, one participant reported that she made a mistake in the way she used that. And therefore, she now needs to make some changes. And she asked me what to do. And I said, this is fantastic. It's great that you're reporting this. It means you're making progress as a researcher and you're doing good reflexivity here. Make sure to report this in the thesis too. So you see, for me, this is all so unique, important. It's real. This is real life, and we're dealing with real people. So why not be honest about it? I generally think it makes things more interesting than they could be.
And it's about honesty as well, right? In terms of the writing later on. And one of the authors that you cited uses the term confessional tales to refer to the way that researchers can affect in terms of the methods we use and the research we carry out. But I would like to listen a little bit about if you problematize this term, confessional tales, because confessional gives the idea that it's a sin, right?
Yes.
But is it really?
No, I mean, I would not say that, obviously. And this is why I cited with caution and saying, well, I don't fully align with that view, obviously, because I don't think that any of this work is, people see my student, for example, saw these experiences as something negative that she didn't know how to approach and report and deal with. Whereas I see that as wonderful evidence of real life experiences. And therefore, I genuinely think that each unique researcher's experience is going to contribute to the unique project that they are doing. Otherwise, every study would be the same. And what's the point of doing research? So I definitely do not see that as a negative, but obviously somebody like the quotation that I had in the slides, they were talking from a time, that quote came from, I can't remember, quite some time ago. So that means that
25 years ago.
Sorry?
25 years ago.
There you go. So you see, I suppose 25 years ago, things had already changed, but I guess that at that time, people were still more concerned with issues of objectivity, neutrality, detachment, even more so than today. So that makes sense that people will say you have to confess what happened and why and so on and so forth. But I certainly see reflexivity as a healthy practice. And obviously, a healthy practice that needs to be exercised with caution, because nobody should be pushed to disclose anything that they're not comfortable with. So that's why where, I think a supervisor or a critical friend or a colleague or a co-author may be handy and in discussing what's suitable or not.
Yeah, and sometimes also be aware that what we write and publish later on will be read by someone, right? Because sometimes we feel comfortable with ourselves and then we write things, but then we forget that later on it will be read. So be prepared to really share what you're writing with someone else.
Absolutely, yes.
You mentioned now about quantitative and mixed methods, and then we have a question about that. Can we talk a little bit about the differences in how reflexivity is practiced across qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method studies in applied linguistics?
So, as I said earlier, researchers will apply, or rather practice, reflexivity according to their own resources, according to their own research culture. So I'm not going to impose how a researcher working within a qualitative or mixed methods or quantitative paradigm should do it, because some of us, for example, work across all of those paradigms. I started off as a qualitative researcher, but these days I do a lot of mixed methods work as well. And I do that because I believe that we don't have one paradigm or one methodology which is better than the other. They all serve different purposes. That's the way I see it, and many, I think, have confirmed this before. However, I do believe, because I've seen it, because I see it, everyone does reflexivity. Perhaps they don't talk about it, but as a quantitative researcher, for example, if I'm looking at a data set and I decide to exclude some answers from a data set, from a questionnaire, because I think that some of my data is contaminated or some of the results are not useful for my research questions. The decision itself of polishing the data, excluding some answers or including others, that is reflexivity. You are making decision based on what? What is guiding those decisions? Is it your research training? Is it your research questions? Is it something else someone has told you? So you see, I believe that every researcher is doing reflexivity, or should be doing reflexivity, in a more transparent and visible way, because it is happening. The way we phrase the items of a questionnaire has a lot to do with our own understanding, our values. So if I'm designing a questionnaire about multilingualism, I personally would want to be sure that in the way I'm phrasing my items, I'm not framing for example, users of other languages as deficient users of one main language, right? That's my choice, which comes from being inclusive, being diverse, and so on and so forth, okay? Other researchers might make different choices in the designing of a questionnaire. And why is that? We need to know, because that clearly affects and shapes the product of our research and the processes as well. So, yeah. I hope that answered the question.
I think so. One last question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that all researchers somehow experience this reflexivity as the examples you just gave. But you said at some moment that reflexivity shouldn't always be like the core focus of all research reports, right? Because the theme of the study is actually the most important one. And then I was wondering if we could have any specific type of research in which the concept of reflexivity could be the key concept. For example, an orthoethnographic study in which the researcher is analyzing their own construction as a researcher. In this very specific type of study, could reflexivity be the key theme?
So I think it's fair to say that reflexivity is certainly something that is more prominent or would go better, if you like, or more hand in hand with certain research tradition. That's clear. And one of them is ethnography or ethnographic-like work. But I still think that reflexivity is something that ought to be practiced by all research traditions and researchers. And again, it's not supposed to make the researcher the center of the world and do what some have called in the literature navel gazing, right? You're not just looking at yourself. You have to look at yourself and disclose elements of yourself as long as they are relevant to the work that you're doing. To give you an example, years ago, I was doing this study with Chinese students, and my focus was on their life story in relation to their engagement with their studies. So obviously I was interested in how the life outside the classroom was shaping their engagement with their own studies. But at one point, one of my participants disclosed something quite personal about her breakup with a boyfriend. And I was thinking, how is this going to be relevant to the actual topic? You've got to be careful not to go too far sometimes with these reflections. It has to be relevant to the work that you're doing. Otherwise, there's no point in sharing it.
Not reading too much between the lines as well, right? Because sometimes as researchers, we start making a lot of conclusions.
Assumptions. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And I promise this is the last question, actually. In research methodology courses that we have in graduate programs, what examples would you say we can do in classroom in order to promote this reflexivity discussions with graduate students, besides the theoretical discussion?
Yeah, without wanting to be too promotional, I suppose there are quite a few examples in the book, actually. It's difficult to say because it could take so many different shapes and forms. It could be writing a research vignette and then asking people to discuss different options of behavior, or asking actually participants to bring some problems that they are experiencing with their own studies, and then getting a group to discuss potential alternatives on how to respond to those issues. I suppose it could take so many different tasks and so many different shapes. But yeah, there are many in the book, actually.
Yeah. So thank you so much once again for joining us. I hope next time I invite you for any activity related to Maranhão, it will be in person again.
Please, yes, I need to be there in the flesh. to feel the warmth of the sun and eat some good fruit and meet some nice people. Yes, please.
So thank you so much.
Thank
Now
you.
I'm going to turn to Portuguese, okay?
Okay. Bye-bye for now.
Pessoal, muito obrigado por participarem da atividade conosco, por acompanharem a palestra do professor Consoli, da Universidade de Edimburgo. A lista de presença está disponível para vocês no chat da transmissão, e às 14h nós retornaremos às atividades do congresso com as mesas redondas, as sessões de comunicação oral. Então, participem conosco das atividades remotas no período da tarde. So, thank you again, Saul, for joining us. And thank you all.
Take care.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.